Welcome to the Traceable Requirements Capture demo of the 3DX series. This is the third demo in the series and will focus on the Traceable Requirements Management app, and so any work covered in previous demos may not be recovered. Traceable Requirements is broken down into three sections. The first is merely capturing the basic requirements given by the client. Next is linking these requirements to the models to which they apply. And lastly, we have to test certain parts to validate their compliance. We will need the Requirements Management app for this demo and will briefly use the Project Management app. The Project Management app will be covered in more detail in the next demo. This is a list of some of the terminology we will run into throughout this demo. We will recover these definitions as needed. The main ones to remember are specification, chapter, requirements, and sub-requirements. A specification is a set of requirements for a project. The chapter is an object to group similar requirements together. Requirements are a physical or functional need of a product, and sub-requirements are a second-tier object to further elaborate on the main requirement. So, we start the Traceable Requirements capture with the creation of the specification requirement. This diagram is to show the structural hierarchy of the requirement specification. Starting at the top, the requirement specification is the overarching item to contain all information related to the requirements and needs of the project. Chapters are used to group similar needs together and act in the same manner as folders in Windows. Requirements detail the precise needs of the project and can be broken down into sub-requirements as necessary. For example, an overall budget requirement can be broken down into budget sub-requirements for specific tasks. And lastly, comments can be inserted at any level of the structure and serve to provide more contextual information for the chapter or requirement. Capturing the project requirements begins with creating the requirement specification item, as this is the overall container. Typically, it is best to create one specification for each project. The same method is used for inserting chapters, comments, and requirements, and is done from the requirement specification space. You do not need to worry about the order in which these are inserted, as all tiers and arrangements can be modified at a later stage. Where applicable, some requirements can be broken down into sub-requirements. As before, select the line item, and now that we have selected a requirement, the new option of sub-requirement becomes available. Locking requirements is intended to prevent multiple users from editing requirements simultaneously and preventing modification once confirmed with the client. We will now demonstrate these first four steps in a quick video example. The Traceable Requirements app is found in the north sector of our compass. Although we defined this as a favorite app earlier on, so it always features in the favorites app, irrespective of which section of the compass we go to. So let's open up requirements. Now to create the first requirement specification, we go to the requirements tab at the side and go requirement specifications. We then select the action button over here and say create a requirement specification. On the right hand side of our page, the definition window appears. So we'll start off by giving this a title. We will call this the demo chassis for the moment. The description is fairly self-explanatory. We'll call this demo chassis requirement specification, and create and close. Our new requirement specification now appears in this window and is automatically created in the in-work state. The next step is to start inserting chapters, comments, and requirements to this requirement specification. So to do this, we open the specification. From here on, please take note of the space that you are working in. In this case, we're dealing with the requirement specification, and that should appear in this corner here. So, to start inserting chapters, requirements, and comments to our requirement specification, we first select the specification and then go back to the action menu and say Insert New. We have the options of chapter, comment, requirement, and sub-requirement, but this doesn't activate until I've selected an actual requirement, which we haven't created as yet. So we'll start off by inserting a chapter. We will break down our requirement specification into 3 chapters. The first will be transverse beams. The description for which can be as such, and we then say create and close. Our new chapter, transverse beams, now appears as a child object to the demo chassis requirement specification. In the same manner, we shall insert a few more sections. Insert new chapter. In the same manner as before, we've now created 2 additional chapters called main longitudinal beams and steering mounts. Inside of these now, we'll start inserting our further chapters if necessary and requirements. So, concerning the main longitudinal beams, we will create a new requirement limiting the maximum weight of the longitudinal beams. To do this, we deselect the demo chassis as the requirement specification and instead select the main longitudinal beams and say insert requirement. We will title this requirement as main beams maximum weight. The comments in here to give further detail will be that now that we're dealing with a requirement, we have a few other additional information that we can input. For example, priorities, the difficulties we may experience in achieving these requirements, and further tagging in the sense that we can define this as a constraint, functional or non-functional item. In this case, limiting the maximum weight would be considered a constraint. And to finish off, just create and close. Our new requirement now appears under the main longitudinal beams chapter. Using the same process, we will now add an additional requirement for manufacturing costs for the entire chassis. As this requirement applies to the entire chassis, it does not fit into the transverse, longitudinal or steering mounts chapters, and so goes to the overarching demo chassis specification requirement. As before, action menu, insert new requirement. So we are limiting the manufacturing cost to 40,000 Rand for each chassis. We'll make this a high priority and the difficulty, let's say low. Create and close again. The chassis is made up of several different parts, each of which can have its own budget. So the chassis manufacturing cost we can further break down into sub-requirements. Now that I've selected a requirement, the sub-requirement option becomes available. As before, input titles and information for the requirement. In this case, we will go for transverse beams cost. So for our example, we will limit the transverse beams to 10,000 of the 40,000 available. In addition to the transverse beam cost, I've added 2 more requirements for the main longitudinal beam cost and the mounts manufacturing cost. The next step is to make sure that the sub-requirements are compatible with the overarching requirement. In this case, the 40,000 Rand in the overarching requirement does break down into 2 instances of 10 and 1 instance of 20,000 Rand. We confirm this compatibility in the system by referring to the parenthood status shown in this column here. The default setting for any new sub-requirement is a suspect parenthood status as shown. We update this by going to the overarching requirement details, in this case, chassis manufacturing cost. We are now in the requirement space for the chassis manufacturing cost requirement and can see the parenthood status of all of its sub-requirements over here. We update these to valid by clicking on the Edit button and changing this from suspect to valid. And save. Refresh. We can now close this window and refresh our Traceable Requirements page as well. All of our parenthood statuses are now updated to valid, as we know that the 40,000 breaks down exactly as shown. Once we've agreed on our requirements, we need to make sure that none of them are changed. So the next step then is to lock requirements as necessary. So we'll select the chassis manufacturing cost, transverse, longitudinal and mount manufacturing, and lock them by going to the Actions menu and clicking Reserve. In the comment section we can say final requirements have been agreed with the client. We'll reserve the sub-requirements, though we've actually selected all of them anyway, and reserve the parameters as well. Done. Now that these requirements have been locked, this shows up in the section over here. That completes the first few steps of the process. We'll now go back to our presentation and cover the next three. Once created and detailed, the requirement specification has to be promoted from private to in work so that other members of the project can access, review, and edit the requirements if necessary. As a project progresses, an initial requirement may be identified as unrealistic, severely limiting, or simply unattainable. Simply deleting or editing the requirement is not advisable, as this would not track the changes it needs over the course of the project. We instead create revisions to maintain traceability and record the development of the specification throughout the project. Typically, requirement revisions are the result of members raising issues. These issues may require discussions and formal decisions in order to close. Due to the requirement specification defining the needs and acceptance criteria of the project, changes will usually require the client's approval. This is gained via formal discussions, meetings, and ultimately a business decision to either reject or accept the changes. Let's now jump back to a video example and discuss the last few steps. The lifecycle status of all the items in 3D Experience is a critical and core function of the program. The lifecycle status of an item can define who can view it, who can edit it, and who can see it. The lifecycle state is applied to each item individually, and therefore the general rule is that by promoting or demoting one item does not affect any other items that it may be related to. In this case, promoting the demo chassis from in-work to frozen will not necessarily promote any other chapter or requirement inside of it to in-work or frozen. To promote comments, chapters, or requirements, we first select the items we're interested in. In our case, it will be the budgetary ones. And rather than individually promoting all of these, we can go to mass promote over here. Once these items are promoted, we can close the window and notice that the status has changed from in work to frozen for all the selected items. In the same manner, we can promote the requirement specification itself, demo chassis, in the same way. We could also promote the demo chassis by individually selecting it and pushing it to in frozen over here. The last method to promote the requirement specification is to go back to Traceable Requirements homepage, select the demo chassis under Requirement Specification, and individually promote from here. If we reopen demo chassis, we now notice that it's been moved to the frozen state. Throughout our project, we will likely encounter requirements that need to be modified due to changing circumstances. The best way to approach this is to start by creating an issue. This can be done by selecting the add sign in the corner, scrolling to issues and saying create issue, or you can go into the actual requirement, select exchange tracking, and go to the issues tab, and then create a new issue. Firstly, we need to give a description of the problem. In this case, the requirement was that the main beams be less than 22 kilos. For our case study, we'll assume that this is too strict a requirement and then produce an issue against it. We then provide further information, such as the estimated start and finish dates for this issue. Information such as priorities and co-owners. And most importantly, we propose a solution. In this case, we will increase the maximum weight from 22 to 30 kilograms and say OK. Next, we must assign someone to resolve this issue. Go to the Assignees window and click Insert Persons. For our demo, I'd like this information to come back to myself, so I will select me and promote the issue from Create to Assign, and again from Assign to active. Once we have promoted the issue, we can now close our window. And now to close the issue, we need to go back into the requirement to which it relates, go to Exchange Tracking, Issues tab, and the newly created issue now appears. To review and resolve this issue, we now open it again. All of the information input into the issue at the very beginning when it was created is now available for all members to see. Whoever was assigned to this issue may now review it and make appropriate action and then close the issue. To close the issue, we select the Close Issue button and input the necessary information. And select Done. Note that the lifecycle state of the issue is immediately changed to closed. We can now close our window. And having decided on the action we're going to take, we now create a revision of the main beam's maximum weight requirement. There are several different ways to do this. The first is to select the main beam maximum weight requirement. Go to Change Control, Revisions, and Create New Revision. This page here will list all previous revisions of each requirement. A simpler and a faster way to do this is back on the main requirement specification page to select the requirement, open the Actions menu, and replace by New Revision. This will automatically update the requirement to revision B, but maintain the same description as we had in revision A. So next step then is to edit this, which we do by clicking the Edit button, double click on the description, and change it as necessary from 22 to 30 kilograms, and say Apply. And let's then unselect Edit and Save. This process covers the creation and modification of the requirement specification. By this point, we have captured the initial project requirements and grouped them into applicable chapters, promoted the requirement specification to frozen, and created revisions of requirements to track the changes. Members are now also able to create discussions, issues, and decisions to discuss any problems or necessary changes to the requirements. At this stage, the requirements are not linked to any parts, and so ensuring compliance and traceability are difficult. This issue is addressed in the next demo video, covering the linking of requirements to models.